It always starts the same way in neighborhoods like this. You buy a home, you move in, you put down roots, and you think you've finally found peace. But then the letters start showing up. The passive-aggressive notes tucked under your doormat, the official-looking envelopes with bold fonts that scream "violation notice," and the constant sense that someone, somewhere, is watching. That's how my story began, and if you've ever dealt with an overzealous HOA, you already know where this is going. Except this time, it didn't stop at lawn measurements, paint colors, or where I parked my truck. No, this time, they set their sights on something far more ridiculous. They wanted me to remove my security cameras. I still remember the exact moment I realized something was wrong. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind where you want to sit outside with a cup of coffee and just breathe. But instead of peace, I found a bright orange slip taped to my front door. It wasn't a warning about my grass. It wasn't a reminder about trash bins. It was a cease and desist order from the HOA, demanding that I take down every single security camera on my property. Their reason? According to them, my cameras were an invasion of privacy and made neighbors uncomfortable. The irony was hard to ignore. The same neighbors who peeked through their blinds at me every chance they got, the same board members who wandered around with clipboards like mall cops, were suddenly worried that I was spying. But I knew better, and the truth about why I had installed those cameras would soon turn their entire argument upside down. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Security cameras are normal. In fact, most insurance companies encourage homeowners to install them. But the letter was crystal clear. Remove them or face escalating fines. And with the HOA, fines don't just mean a slap on the wrist. They pile up fast, and before you know it, they can put a lien on your home. That's the game they play, control through intimidation. Still, this wasn't about intimidation anymore. I had those cameras for a reason. A very real, very serious reason. You see, for weeks before that notice, strange things had been happening around my property. Small things at first. My trash cans were knocked over, my packages went missing, and someone even scratched the side of my truck. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence, maybe kids messing around. But when I found cigarette butts in my backyard, a yard that no one should have access to, I knew it was something more. That's when I decided to install the cameras, not to spy on anyone, not to make neighbors uncomfortable, but to protect myself, my family, and my home. And within just a few days, those cameras had already started picking up some shocking footage that the HOA had no idea I had in my possession. The first video was simple but unsettling. A figure walking up my driveway at 2 in the morning, shining a flashlight around, then quickly running off when the motion light turned on. The second was worse, someone rattling my back gate, trying to force it open. And the third was the one that would eventually make even the police laugh at the HOA's demands. But before I get there, I need to explain how the HOA doubled down. Because once I didn't respond to their first notice, they escalated quickly. Suddenly, I was being hit with daily fines. They sent me another letter claiming that I was collecting data on neighbors without consent. They even accused me of stalking through surveillance. The accusations were outrageous, and yet they put everything in writing as if it were fact. My first instinct was to fight back with reason. I sent them an email explaining why the cameras were installed and what they had already caught. But they didn't care. In fact, I'm pretty sure my explanation only made them more determined to push me. Because if there's one thing power-hungry HOA boards hate, it's being challenged. Soon it wasn't just letters. One of the board members, a woman with a reputation for being nosy about everything, actually came onto my property and tried to cover one of the cameras with duct tape. Luckily, the camera recorded her doing it, and I saved the footage. But instead of apologizing, she doubled down, claiming I was harassing her by watching. It was surreal, like living in a neighborhood where common sense didn't exist. By this point, I realized this wasn't going to be solved with polite emails or quiet compliance. They were targeting me, and the only way this was going to end was if I stood my ground. That's when I made the decision to involve the police, not because I wanted to escalate, but because I wanted an official record of what was happening. If the HOA wanted to play hardball, I was ready. When the officer showed up, I handed him the stack of letters and explained the situation. I also pulled out my laptop and played the footage. The first video made him raise an eyebrow. The second made him nod. And the third, well, that one made him lean back in his chair and actually laugh. Because the third video didn't just show a random trespasser or a suspicious figure. It showed one of the HOA board members themselves, sneaking around my side yard with what looked like a screwdriver, trying to tamper with my electrical box. At that moment, everything shifted. The officer told me in no uncertain terms that the cameras weren't the problem here. The problem was the HOA board member who had been caught red-handed on video. Suddenly, it wasn't about me spying. It was about someone in a position of power abusing it, breaking the law, and then trying to silence the one person who had proof. But as satisfying as that moment was, I knew this was only the beginning. Because if there's one thing about HOAs, it's that they don't go down quietly. They would fight tooth and nail to cover themselves, even if it meant twisting the truth further. And I was ready to expose every bit of it. The battle lines had been drawn, and the next move was theirs. The moment the officer leaned back in his chair and let out that laugh, I knew the entire game had changed. What started as a ridiculous accusation from the HOA had just turned into something far more serious, a legal matter, and one that they could no longer twist in their favor. But as anyone who's dealt with these neighborhood boards knows, they rarely admit defeat. Instead, they scramble, deny, and push even harder. That's exactly what happened next. After reviewing the footage, the officer made an official note in his report. He told me to keep my cameras up and running, not only for my safety, but also because the evidence might become important later. Hearing that from law enforcement was like a weight off my chest. For weeks, the HOA had been making me feel like I was the one breaking rules, like I was the problem. Now, I had confirmation that the law was firmly on my side. Still, the HOA wasn't done. Within 2 days of that police visit, I received another letter. This one wasn't just a violation notice. It was a formal board decision, stating that I had exactly 7 days to remove all my cameras or face a fine of $500 per day. They worded it like it was final, non-negotiable, and legally binding. What they didn't realize was that their own board member had already torpedoed their case by tampering with my property. And I wasn't about to let them bully me into silence, so I made a move they didn't expect. I forwarded all of their letters, plus the footage, directly to the police department and also to a local attorney who specialized in property disputes. I wasn't necessarily planning to sue, not yet at least, but I wanted the HOA to understand that I wasn't afraid to take it that far. At the same time, I started to notice a shift in the neighborhood. Word had gotten out. Neighbors who once avoided me were now asking questions. Some were curious about the cameras, but others had their own stories. Stories about missing packages, strange noises at night, and even damage to their property. Suddenly, my cameras didn't seem like such a bad idea to them. It became clear that the HOA's biggest fear wasn't really about privacy. It was about exposure. If my cameras caught one of their board members sneaking around, who else might they catch? What other dirty secrets might come to light? That, more than anything, explained their desperation to shut me down. Then came the night that sealed the deal. It was around midnight when one of my motion alerts pinged my phone. Normally, I might have ignored it, but something told me to check. When I opened the live feed, my heart stopped. There, right in front of my garage, was a man I didn't recognize. He wasn't just wandering, he was trying to pry the door open with a crowbar. I called the police immediately, giving them the live footage as it happened. Within minutes, a patrol car rolled into the neighborhood, lights flashing, siren wailing. The man bolted, but he didn't get far. Thanks to the footage, the police knew exactly what he looked like and where he ran. They caught him 2 blocks away. When the officers came back to my house, they didn't just thank me. They told me outright that my cameras had prevented a burglary and that without them, the man might have gotten inside. They even mentioned that the suspect matched the description of someone connected to several other break-ins around the area. That was the moment the narrative completely flipped. The HOA wanted me to take the cameras down, claiming they were a nuisance. But now, I had direct evidence that those cameras were protecting not just me, but the entire neighborhood. And yet, even with that proof, the HOA still wouldn't back off. The next morning, I found another letter on my door. This time, it accused me of creating unnecessary panic by spreading rumors of crime. They claimed I was damaging the reputation of the community by involving the police and that my cameras painted the neighborhood in a negative light. Reading it, I couldn't help but laugh. Their obsession with control had blinded them completely. They were more worried about appearances than safety, but I also knew this letter was gold, because in trying to silence me, they had put in writing that they valued reputation over real security. If this ever went to court, that letter would destroy them. By now, the police were more involved than ever. An officer actually called me a few days later to check on things and to let me know the suspect they arrested had confessed to casing multiple houses. My footage was being used as part of the evidence against him. In other words, the very cameras the HOA wanted gone were helping solve real crimes. That alone should have been enough to shut the board down, but instead they tried one last, desperate tactic. They called an emergency meeting and invited several homeowners to attend. Their goal was clear. They wanted to turn the neighborhood against me, to paint me as the problem child who was making life uncomfortable. What they didn't realize was that by now, plenty of my neighbors had already seen the clips. I hadn't gone out of my way to share them, but word spreads fast when something this dramatic happens. So when the board tried to stand up there and rant about spying and harassment, the crowd wasn't buying it. In fact, some people started asking the board why they weren't grateful the cameras had caught a real criminal. That meeting ended in chaos. The board couldn't control the narrative anymore, and for the first time, I saw cracks in their armor. They weren't the untouchable authority they pretended to be. They were just a handful of power-hungry neighbors who finally realized they had picked the wrong fight. After the meeting, I went home, knowing things were far from over. The HOA still had its rules, its fines, and its arrogance. But I had something stronger: the law, the truth, and the support of my neighbors. The battle wasn't finished, but for the first time, I felt like victory was within reach. And as it turned out, the final showdown would be even more shocking than anything so far. By the time the so-called emergency meeting collapsed into chaos, I already knew the HOA had lost control of their narrative. The board members looked shaken, their faces tight with frustration as neighbors whispered among themselves. What was once a group that commanded absolute authority now looked like nothing more than a clique desperate to hold on to power. But I also knew better than to celebrate too early. With HOAs, you don't win with one meeting, one video, or even one police report. They always try to regroup, to claw back their authority. And sure enough, the very next week, I received a certified letter in the mail. This time, they weren't just threatening fines, they were threatening legal action. The letter claimed I was defaming the reputation of the HOA and its board members. They accused me of unauthorized surveillance, and they even hinted at civil damages if I didn't comply with their demands. Reading it, I could see the desperation between every line. They were cornered, and when cornered, they lashed out. But what they didn't realize was that I was more prepared than ever. I gathered every piece of evidence I had. The violation notices, the threatening letters, the footage of their board member tampering with my electrical box, and of course, the arrest that my cameras had made possible. With all of this in hand, I scheduled a meeting with the attorney I'd spoken to earlier. The look on his face as he flipped through the files said it all. He told me point blank that if the HOA pushed this any further, they were walking straight into a losing battle. Not only would their threats fall apart in court, but I could counter with claims of harassment, invasion of privacy, and even attempted property damage. Suddenly, I wasn't just defending myself, I had the power to turn the tables. Meanwhile, the police were still involved. The officer who'd first reviewed my footage followed up again, letting me know that the suspect caught in my driveway had pled guilty. My video had been submitted as key evidence, and the department actually wanted to thank me for helping close the case. The irony couldn't have been stronger. While the HOA claimed my cameras were a problem, law enforcement saw them as a tool for justice. I decided it was time to make one final move. A move that would either end this once and for all, or drag it into the open for everyone to see. I drafted a letter of my own. It wasn't angry, and it wasn't emotional. It was factual, calm, and backed by evidence. In it, I explained that my cameras were not only fully legal, but also actively protecting the community, as proven by the recent arrest. I reminded them that their board member had been caught trespassing and tampering with my property. I attached copies of the police report, the officer's written statement, and screenshots of the footage. Then, I added one final line. If the HOA continued harassing me, I would pursue legal action for damages and harassment. I sent the letter by certified mail to every single board member. I also quietly shared a copy with a few neighbors who had been supportive, because if there's one thing boards hate more than losing control, it's losing the secrecy they hide behind. The reaction came faster than I expected. Within days, another notice appeared in my mailbox, but this one was different. It wasn't a violation, it wasn't a threat, it was a board update announcing that the HOA had reviewed community concerns and decided to clarify the rules regarding security equipment. The new policy? Cameras were permitted as long as they were mounted on the homeowner's property. In other words, they had caved. Of course, they didn't admit defeat, they didn't apologize, they didn't acknowledge that they had tried to bully me into silence. Instead, they spun it as if they had listened to feedback and adapted for the good of the community. But I didn't need an apology. The fact that they reversed their stance was proof enough that I'd won. Still, the aftermath was fascinating to watch. Some neighbors who had once supported the board suddenly became much quieter. Others started installing cameras of their own, no longer worried about being threatened. And as for the board member who had been caught sneaking around with a screwdriver, she quietly stepped down a few months later, citing personal reasons. The best part, though, was the shift in how the police viewed the situation. A sergeant actually called me to thank me again, saying that community members with security systems were often their biggest allies in solving crimes. He chuckled when I mentioned the HOA's earlier demands, and he said, "If they want you to take those down, maybe they should try explaining that to the judge who used your footage to put a criminal behind bars." That single line summed up everything. The HOA could posture, threaten, and intimidate all they wanted, but at the end of the day, the law wasn't on their side. Common sense wasn't on their side, and for once, even the neighborhood wasn't on their side. Looking back, I realized the entire ordeal had taught me something important. HOAs thrive on fear. They count on homeowners being too intimidated to push back, too worried about fines or liens to fight for their rights. But the truth is, once you shine a light on their behavior, once you expose them for what they really are, their power crumbles fast. All it took was one camera, one video, and one moment of undeniable truth. And in the end, the same cameras they tried to rip from my walls are still mounted today, quietly recording, silently protecting, and serving as a reminder that sometimes standing your ground isn't just about you. Sometimes it's about showing an entire community that they don't have to be afraid. The police laughed at the HOA's demands, the neighbors learned the truth, and the board was forced to back down. And that's how a ridiculous battle over spying ended with the HOA exposed, the community safer, and me walking away with my cameras exactly where they belonged. Because when the truth is on your side, no amount of intimidation can tear it down.